ちは。城西国際大学学長の杉林健二と申します。よろしくお願いします。今日は城西国際大学グローバルレクチャーシリーズの一環といたしまして、シェアリー・アン・樋口さんとサム・宮原さんに講演をいただきます。今回のタイトルはセツコの秘密、ハートマウンテンと日系米国人強制収容のレガシーというタイトルでございます。今日ですね、皆さんに、シャリーさんと宮原さんをお呼びして講演していただくきっかけについてまずご説明させていただきたいと思います。昨年の11月です。シャリーさんが日本の外務省から招待を受けて来日されました。その時、シャリーさんからお呼びがかかりまして、私ども薬学関係者数名もお会いいたしました。その時初めてですね、私たちはハートマウンテンのお話を伺いました。でここでなぜシャリーさんが我々薬学関係者をお呼びされたかという理由でございますけれども、これは、シャリーさんのお父さん、すなわちウィリアム・アイ・樋口先生が長年の間ミシガン大学、ユタ大学に多くの薬学研究者を招待されて、そこで研究の面倒を見ておられました。大変多くの日本人の学者さんを育てたということで、数年前日本の勲章を受勲されております。さて、シャーリーさんですけれども、シャーリーさんのお父様の名前は先ほど申しましたウィリアム先生ですが、お母様のお名前を節子さんとおっしゃいます。で今回、シャーリーさんは「SETSUKO'Sシークレット」「節子の秘密」という本を出されました。昨年11月に来日された時にこの本が今年の9月に上示されるということで、その時に再来日されるというふうにお聞きしておりましたので、私はぜひこのハートマウンテンのお話を城西国際大学の学生にお話していただきたいということをお願いし、ご快諾を得ていたのですが、このコロナ禍の状況でシャーリーさんは来日できなくなりました。そこでこのようなオンデマンドの講演会とオンラインの Q&A をですねさせていただくということでお願いしたところ、今回のこの催し物になったということでございます。ちなみにサム・宮原さんは実際に強制収容所、ハートマウンテンの強制収容所に入られた方でございます。この強制収容所に入られたのは1942年のことですから、今から78年も前のことになります。さて、今日はですね、日本薬剤学会の講演をいただいております。日本薬剤学会の創設者であり、今名誉会長であられます永井恒次先生も今日この後、この動画の後に出ていただくことになっております。永井先生は最初にミシガン大学に行かれて、樋口先生と一緒に研究された中でございます。今日はそういう意味で薬学関係者、それからもちろん城西国際大学の関係者、それからハートマウンテンの関係者の方々がこの動画をご覧になっていると思います。ぜひ楽しんで見ていただければというふうに思っておりますけれども、 Q&A コーナーに関しましては今年の10月31日9時半から、Zoom を使ったライブで開催させていただきますので、ぜひこちらの方も楽しんでいただければというふうに思っております。城西国際大学はですね、国際大学ですから多文化共生、多文化のことをよく理解してお互いに違う文化で育って土地で育った方がいろいろお話して仲良くなっていくということを大変重要視しております。最近ではブラック・ライブズ・マターのような言葉がございますし、 自国優先主義もございますが、ぜひ、いろんな国の人たちが話し合ってできる雰囲気になればいいかなというふうに思っています。そういう意味ではですね、今日のこの講演会はまさにうってつけの話題ではないかと思っております。ぜひ皆さんとご一緒に楽しんでいきたいと思っております。今日はよろしくお願いします。どうもありがとうございました。
永井常次先生はお姉様が医師であり、親戚にも医師が多かったことから自身も医師になることを考えておられましたが、薬師様はあっても医師様はないことや、病気を治しているのは医師でなく薬であると気づき、1952年に東京大学薬学部に入学されました。大学卒業後の東京大学助手時代に創世期の薬剤学を支えた教育者・研究者であった恩師野上久先生の指導に従い、1965年にコロンビア大学に留学されました。しかし別の機関でも勉強したいと考えられ、すでに薬剤学分野で活躍されていた日系アメリカ人タケル樋口先生に相談されました。タケル先生はその時ちょうどカンザス大学に移動中ということで、すでにミシガン大学に赴任されていたタケル先生の弟のウィリアム・アイ・樋口先生の下で勉強されることを推薦なさったということです。その結果、翌年1966年にはミシガン大学に留学されました。半世紀以上も前のことですが、永井先生はコロンビア大学やミシガン大学での出来事、また帰国後にも何度もユタ大学のウィリアム・アイ・樋口先生のラボを訪問したことなどよく覚えておられ、いろいろと話してくださいました。最後に永井先生は、薬学は素晴らしい学問であると述べられ、今の若い教育者・研究者にはもっと気概を持って頑張ってもらいたいとエールを送られました。さらにSETSUKO'Sシークレットを書かれたシャーリー・アン・樋口さんにねぎらいとお祝いを述べられました。
私は1960何年だっけかな、65年から6年に5年からですね、アメリカに留学したんですが、私の父親のちょうどいとこになる人で角田龍作っていう人がいましてね、我々一族の中では憧れの人なんですが、コロンビア大学に日本図書館を作った人なんですね。私はそこへ一度行ってみたいなと思っていたんですが、なかなか行く機会がなかったんですけども、私の一番上の姉の医者になって、その先生のつてでもって、コロンビア大学に、留学することになったんですけれど、私はとにかくコロンビア大学へ何しに行ったかというと、インシュリンの結晶を作ることで行ったんですね。先生は有名なバーバラロという女性の先生なんですが、メインテーマがインシュリンの構造決定ですね。ニューヨークはご存知の通り、世界の有名人が来るところですから、毎回有名人が来るたびに、セミナーに参加してですね、ノーベル賞受賞者なんかをしょっちゅう見てたわけです。その方がもう一代前の、ホーティギンズですね、ビタミン 12 の結晶構造を決定して、ロー先生の研究室に来られたんであったんですが、でみんな寄ってきて握手するのにね、私はまだ日本から行ったばっかりではにかめてもなかったんですが、だいぶ後ろの方にいたら、なんで前に出てこいって言って、前に出されて、指さされていたのを覚えてます。例えばバーンシュタインとかですね、ちょっと そこで会えないような人が、それからウエストサイド物語だとかですね、有名な美術館もかかっていたんで、そういうところにも行ってみることができました。ちょうどその時にニューヨークメトロポリタンアーフスが移転するっていうですから最後の観客にもなったし、すごく関係したことがあります。私の恩師の野上先生がですね、2年間は留学していいんだと。でその間にできたら2箇所へ行って1箇所じゃなくて2箇所へ行ってきなさいと。竹野樋口先生ですね、この先生はしょっちゅう日本に来ておられましたから、全然アメリカ来た時にはぜひやんなさいって言われていたんでですね、樋口先生に相談したら、ちょうどその時に樋口先生が観察大学が移るのが決まったところなんですね。で今来ても面倒見なきゃいけないから、ちょうど弟がちょうどミシガン大学に行ってるから、そこ行って1年間勉強して、それで日本に帰りなさいって言って、で私はなんとラッキーな人間だろうと思いながらミシガンに行ったんですよ。でミシガン大学はご存知のように公立の大学の中でアメリカで最初にできた国ですね。だから150年をさやるっていうその時に行ったんですが、その時大変な勉強をしました。とにかく教育がすごく進んでる国で、薬学、医学、看護学学会でね、そういうのがあるんですよね。日本で言えば薬学が先に出てくることは待ってもし医学やなんかと一緒の時に薬学が先に出てくることはめったにないですね。最近医科のところにできたどこでも薬学が出て先に来ないです。本当はずっと歴史的には薬学はもう紀元前にできて生まれてですね、ダルトンだとかリービヒとかノーベル賞級の学者が出てるんですが、薬学はもうちゃんと世界では高い評価を受けているのに、日本では薬学ってのはね、なんか合格に釣られたような感じのことなんですよね。ミシガン大学っていうのはトップ10の中のでも最初に行ったコロンビア大学はランキングが4番目ですから、みんなすごいところに私は行った勉強はそれほどためになるようなことはしなかったんですけど、私の非常に大事なこととしてですね、2カ所の大学に行ったということですね。その人たちと知り合うだけで大変だ。留学なんていうのは本を見れば分かるとか言って、留学というのをバカにする先生もおるんですが、私はそうではないとこういうことを考えております。私にとっては一番有意義な
その当時のウィリアム・樋口先生のお様子はいかがだったんですか？
もうまだまだ若くて一番油の乗り切るまだ乗り切るまでもうあの頃から頭角を現しておられてですね、大体みんなどこでも知ってる人ですね。奥さんも本が出てきましたけども、その時はまだ奥さんも健在でありました。
その当時にシャーリーさんにはお会いになりましたか？
いやまだまだ女学校は卒業したかどうかは分からないけど、それでまだまだちゃんと1年前になってなかったんじゃないかとかね。竹野樋口先生とウィリアム・ビル・樋口先生と私ではちょうどお二方はですね、私を兄弟のようなつもりで面倒見てくれたんですね。
ぜひウィリアム先生にもご挨拶していただきたいと思います。
それでね、ビル・樋口先生ね、私は I'm all right and I'm happy to see you. Your degree the award ceremony in Michigan, Ann Arbor, that was very long ago. But I never forget that drink and that high honor. And you also received the Japanese emperor from the order of rising sun. It is the very highest grade of the emperor's prize. So again, I want to say congratulations for my friends.
Hello, it's an honor to be here today. Thank you very much, Professor Sugabayashi, Professor Nagai. I think this meeting is very important, and I'm glad I am here today. We have known the Japanese students in the United States for many years with my father's work at the University of Utah and also the University of Michigan. So the connection with the Japanese community is very, very important to my life and also important to my book, Setsuko's Secret, Heart Mountain, and the Legacy of the Japanese American Incarceration. The book is after my mother, Setsuko, and it talks about Setsuko's life, whom many of the Japanese doctoral students of my father know, because my mother had much hospitality for all the students when they were in the United States. So it was very important for my father to build a relationship with the Japanese students while they were here, and my mother had helped with that for many, many, many decades. But I don't know if many of you know that my parents actually met as children at the Heart Mountain relocation camp in Wyoming. Unfortunately, during World War II, when the war broke out between Japan and the United States, my mother, who was only a little girl, and my father, who was a little boy, they were ripped from their homes in California and put into a camp in Wyoming, which is very far away from California where they lived. And my mother, Setsuko, rarely talked about what happened at Heart Mountain. So that's why this discussion is very important, so the Japanese people can understand what happened to the Japanese Americans during World War II. So my mother and father's generation is called the Nisei, second generation Japanese American. And because of the culture and their upbringing, it was very important for them to have gaman, to endure, and not look back. So they really didn't talk about their experiences in camp even though it was a very, very, very critical time in their lives. And a lot of this happened, as you know. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in the United States on December 7th, 1941. And what happened at that time is there was a lot of hysteria and craziness in the media with different organizations wanting to get rid of the Japanese immigrants and their children who were American citizens. And there were terrible things they were suggesting, even like forced sterilization, which we sometimes hear about in the United States with other groups that have occurred in the past. So many Americans believed that the Japanese Americans posed a security threat and endangered the United States of America because they were in the middle of a war with Japan. So what happened next was just 2 months after the Pearl Harbor attack, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which basically got the United States to agree through their military to take all the Japanese Americans off California and the West Coast, 120,000 individuals of Japanese descent. They took away their homes, their businesses, their jobs, and put them into 10 camps situated in Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, Utah, away from, they believe, the danger zone, even though there was really no danger. Because, you know, afterwards, the United States admitted that what they did was wrong and they apologized because there was no evidence of espionage or sabotage. There was no no problem. It was basically a big discrimination against Japanese and Japanese Americans, because Japanese people, as you could tell from my face, even though I'm an American citizen, it's very noticeable. So when I go to Japan, people think that I'm Japanese. My father had a farm in San Jose, California, Northern California, and they had 14.25 acres, which is a lot of land in California. And unfortunately, because they were put in this camp, they were forced to sell the farm at pennies to the dollar. So if they were able to keep that farm, and we had that farm today, we would be very, 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 very rich. Millions and millions of dollars worth of land today we lost back in 1942. The first thing that happened before my parents and their families got put into Heart Mountain, they put everybody in a racetrack. And they had a couple of racetrack and assembly centers where it was temporary housing. So unfortunately, the Japanese that were put in this situation were in horse stalls with manure. You know, the smell was very, very bad. It was horrible conditions, you know, basically sleeping with horse manure on sticky hay. So they treated a lot of the Japanese like animals by putting them in these type of assembly centers, which was a pretty bad situation. But what they ended up doing, though, is finally building the camps, and Heart Mountain ended up being our camp. Heart Mountain Camp ended up being the third largest town in the entire state of Wyoming. So if you could understand this, it would like be building a prison camp and realizing that that camp is literally the third largest city in Wyoming, which is pretty incredible. Inside the camp, the Japanese American incarcerees, they lived in like these tar paper barracks. There was no running water. Insulation was terrible, you know, because, you know, the holes like were like this big, and the wind would come in with sand, you know, during the summer, and during the winter, snow and rain would get in, and the wind came in through the cracks, and it was very, 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 very uncomfortable. And a lot of times these barracks, you know, weren't that big, and a lot of people would crowd in there and their family members. So they would all be in one room, you know, mommy, daddy, maybe grandfather, grandpa, then children. And it would made it very, very difficult. And a lot of Japanese Americans felt a lot of shame because they knew they were being singled out. And it has become a big issue now today that a lot of Japanese Americans like me, you know, look at what happened to their parents and they want to talk about it. They want to get all the information out, not only for us to educate ourselves on what the problems and issues were 75, 78 years ago, but also for it to be a lesson on what not to do to people just because they look different than you. So eventually the war ended. My father's family eventually tried to get back to San Jose, although they had to move around a lot. For SETSUKO'S family, my mother, they had a hard time finding a place to live. They ended up living in a hotel, and my grandfather continued to work and try to find a way to get a good job making money. But what happened with my parents, they were just children when they met in camp. But many, many years later, they bumped into each other at the University of California, Berkeley, and then they recognized each other from camp, and then they fell in love and got married. So it's kind of interesting when we think back that but for the incarceration of the Japanese Americans, I wouldn't be here talking to you because my parents would have never met. So it's very important to sort of reflect on these experiences and think through what are the implications of whether, you know, certain things happened during war and certain things didn't happen. Those things really change our lives a lot. But after my mother's death, Setsuko died in 2005, I began to understand more of the Heart Mountain story. And they asked me to become involved, even though it was a little bit of a secret and my mother never talked about it. We had our grand opening in August 2011, and many famous people came to that event. I don't know if many of you have heard of Secretary Norman Mineta. He's one of the most famous Japanese Americans. He was there. Senator Daniel K. Inouye of Hawaii was there. And they talked about how brave many of the young Japanese American men were, because they actually volunteered to fight in the army when they turned 18 and defend the United States when they were also being imprisoned by the United States. So it was a little, let's just say it was a little confusing, and it conflicted a lot with what made sense for the Japanese Americans. But also we have several young men who said, you know, we're going to be resistors. We're going to not go and fight in a war when we're being imprisoned by our own country. And we actually have a resistor who sits on our board, Dr. Takashi Hoshizaki, who is one of our famous board members, who actually said, no, I am not going to go fight on this country's behalf unless you reinstate my rights and make me a full citizen with rights and privileges as a US citizen. Another potential discovery that came through in my research for Setsuko's Secret is Sam Mihara, who is my next speaker today. Now, Sam actually knew my mother before the war and after the war, and he'll talk about Setsuko in his presentation. But he came to the grand opening, and when he came to the grand opening, he felt a sense of acceptance. He also felt that he needed to tell this story as a former prisoner. But Sam didn't know me because my mother's name is Setsuko Saito, and I'm Shirley Higuchi, my father's name. So we didn't even know that we knew each other's families until he came onto the board. So this secret relationship that my mother had in some ways with Sam really didn't come out until after her death and after our work with Heart Mountain. But what is really nice about the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation and having a museum is I get to discover more relationships that my mother had in her lifetime when she was growing up as a young woman in San Francisco, California. And it's really a gift to be able to keep your mother's memory alive when you get to continue to meet people who have known her and is aware of who she was over the last, 80 to 90 years. She's no longer with us. Time, I would like to introduce Sam Mihara, who was an incarceree at Heart Mountain and also knew my mother before and after the war.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Sugibayashi. My name is Sam Mihara. I am a Nisei, a Japanese American who went through the prison camp in World War II. I'm going to show you a few slides that summarizes my story. First, let me introduce you to my family. This is a photo taken in 1939. That's the Mihara family, the young fellow with the folded arms in the front, that's me. I was about roughly about 7 years old. My brother next to me, my father behind me, my mother to the right, and Grandpa and Grandma Mihara seated in the front. The older Miharas are called Issei because they are first generation. They were the immigrants. My brother and I were born in San Francisco, and so we are Nisei, or second generation. Let me introduce you to another family. This is the Saito family. The photograph was taken at a reception party, which was celebrating the passing of one of the young brothers in the Saito family. On the right, you see in the front, my friend Hiroshi Saito. He was my schoolmate in grammar school and high school. In the middle, you see Setsuko Saito. And behind Setsuko is her older brother, Fumio Saito. Fumio had a great impact on my career when I was in school. And that's me holding a drink and a bite to eat. I was about, in this picture, about 8 years old. My recollection of Setsuko, she was, extremely kind. Then it took 3 months to build the main camps, which is in these triangles. There is one in Heart Mountain, Wyoming, which is where I went, one in Idaho, one in Utah, one in Colorado, 2 out here in Arkansas, 2 in southern Arizona, and 2 on the desolate eastern side of California. This is a map of the Heart Mountain, Wyoming camp. There were 30 blocks. Each block had 24 barracks. Each barrack had 25 people. I was living in this block number 14. The Saito family lived way out here in the southwest corner in block number 2. So they have to walk their block to the hospital because there was no public transportation. So round trip, it would be almost 5 kilometers. And Mrs. Saito at that time was expecting a baby. Difficult to have to force people to walk to the hospital. These are the barracks. This is one barrack after another. This is the barbed wire fence that ran around the entire camp. And these are guard towers that had, when I went there, I remember seeing guards with weapons. At one time held over 10,000 people, 20 feet by 20 feet. And that exactly the room that my family, the Mihara family, lived in at that time. Here's a photograph of our family in front of the barrack. That's me. I was here in this picture, maybe about 10 years old. My brother, my mother, and her sisters in the back row, and my uncle. The toilets were embarrassing. The toilets, this toilet, about 10 seats, serves 300 people. You see here bread and potatoes and pickled vegetables. We call it oshinko or tsukemono. And inside this pitcher was powdered milk. Japanese in 1941 and 42 did not eat that type of food. We love fresh vegetables. We like a little bit of poultry, like chicken and eggs and fresh milk. And we like rice and fish. So the government allowed us to build farms and provide our own type of food. The winters were very, very bad. It got down, that first winter, it got down to minus 33 degrees centigrade, minus 33. It was very, very cold. We had a hospital, but all it was more barracks and connected by a hall. My father had a case called glaucoma of the eyes, before he went to the camp. Before he went to camp in San Francisco, he was being treated by a special doctor who knew how to take care of his eyes. And I remember he was able to see until he had to go to Wyoming. But once in Wyoming, in the prison camp, there were no specialists, no one who knew how to take care of his eyes. And General DeWitt would not let him go back to see his special eye doctor. As a result, my father became blind. He became mekuda inside the camp. My grandfather was a healthy person going into camp, but he died in camp. And the cause of the death was cancer, a colon cancer. And I remember he suffered very severely. I watched him because the doctors did not know how to make a person who has cancer at least try to make him survive as much as possible. So he died and we lost Grandpa. Toward the end, there was an attorney, a person who specializes in law in San Francisco. His name is James Purcell, a Hakujin. And he figured out how to get us out of the prison. What he did was he found one of the prisoners by the name of Endo, Mitsuo Endo. And he found that she had a perfect record. She did exactly what the government told her to do. She went to camp, didn't complain, and she was completely loyal to the United States. So Mr. Purcell filed a lawsuit against the government saying, you cannot keep a person who is a loyal US citizen in a prison. So he demanded that the government release her. And the Supreme Court decided, yes, let her go. And at the same time, let everyone go who is considered loyal to the United States. And that's how the camp were closed. Ronald Reagan saw this picture and among many other activities to try to convince him to change, President Reagan finally signed a bill being a proposal from the Congress to say the government apologizes to all the people of Japanese ancestry who were inside this prison. I received a letter from President George Bush. This is 2 years after President Reagan signed the bill, and President Bush is now in charge. And he sent me a letter saying the words, sincere apology, along with a small check to help pay for the damages. I'm going to conclude then with the thought, why did these prisons exist? And there were 3 reasons. The first reason was there was racial prejudice, people who hated Japanese, but not Germans and Italians. There was hysteria, which is getting the public all excited. And the media, the newspapers, the political headlines had driven the public to think that it's time to remove Japanese. But most important are some leaders who failed to honor our constitutional rights. Like I mentioned, President Roosevelt failed to preserve our constitutional rights.
Thank you very much, Sam, for that wonderful presentation. And I appreciate you working with me to build Heart Mountain into a very, very special place. Right now, I'm going to read 2 simple passages from my book. One is in the beginning of the book when I discovered my mother's secret of wanting something to be built at Heart Mountain. And the afterword, the last chapter in the book, talks about my visit to Japan and how I learned another secret. When I asked my mother, Setsuko Saito Higuchi, where she wanted the koden, the traditional Japanese condolence money gift, I thought she was going to say Johns Hopkins University, where she was being treated for pancreatic cancer that was ravaging her body. Heart Mountain, she told us. Why? My two brothers and I knew of Heart Mountain, this mysterious place in my parents' past. But beyond that, we knew next to nothing. But my father, William, knew exactly what my mother wanted. Heart Mountain was this place where over 14,000 Japanese individuals, 2/3 which were American citizens, were forced into following the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. And there my parents met as young children in their 7th grade classroom. And if you look at a 9th grade photograph, you see them together in the front row. My mother was a beautiful and unusually poised city girl from San Francisco, sits next to my father, this young and ruggedly handsome young man who helped his parents and older brothers run a farming business, which is now known as Silicon Valley today. They and their families endured the cold, snowy days on the flat wind-scoured plains 60 miles east of Yellowstone National Park. Each day, they faced the barbed wire penning them inside the camp where the guards' machine guns face inward and not out. My mother maintained a typical reserve of her generation as a US-born generation of Japanese Americans known as the Nisei. Despite being American citizens by birth, Nisei were rounded up and incarcerated in what the government called relocation or internment camps. Many of those willing to accommodate camps for Japanese forced from their homes, such as the governors of Idaho and Wyoming, referred to them as prisoners, and they were not real Americans. My mother referred to the Nisei as the quiet American, a silence that masked a multitude of scars from the incarceration and its accompanying racism. This silence meant keeping up appearances to keep the white Americans believing that we were part of America. For my mother, she was very silent about this conversation, and she just saw it as just a speed bump in her life. She never talked about her time at Heart Mountain. Now I would like to read the final chapter of my book, and this is about my trip to Japan. Thanks to the Japanese government, I traveled to Japan last November to speak to student groups and then meet one of my relatives in my father's family in Saga Prefecture. I had few expectations for this meeting, but it turned out to be the perfect ending of my book. So the Japanese government had located Sumiko Aikawa, who's my grandmother's beloved niece. She's already like about 89. And we had a great, superb interpreter, personal driver, and assistant. So that way I could communicate with Sumiko easily because she didn't speak any English and I don't speak Japanese very well. So what I ended up doing is I bought her 10 photos of my family in Heart Mountain to try to get her to talk a little bit more and express herself. And she was very quiet, but when I showed her the photograph, she became very alert. The trigger that happened in her deep, deep memory was something that opened up my eyes and opened up Sumiko's eyes. First, she looked at the photo of the racetrack, the first part where my family went to. And I told her about how my Aunt Emily had gotten lost the first day at the racetrack with, hundreds and hundreds of Japanese faces there. Emily, who was just 5 years old, got very confused. So she wandered away when she was going to the bathroom. My grandmother, Chie, my father said, was delirious with worry, which was the first sign I had seen or heard of that my grandmother could fall apart. So it was useful to hear some of the emotional distress my grandmother was, because it helped bring that story to life in my book. Sumiko then looked at the photo of the Heart Mountain Museum, which looks a lot like the prison camp now. So all of you should come to the United States and visit the museum. It's very, very good. But suddenly her memories flooded back and she started crying and many tears started coming out. And then I started crying. And then Sumiko said that Chie, my grandmother, had returned to Saga Prefecture in 1957 after the war. And, at this time, Sumiko was a very young woman, very young. So Chie visited her brother, Sumiko's father, and they would stay up very late at night and talk about what happened in the United States, what happened at Heart Mountain, how horrible the war was. And, during this period where my grandmother and grandfather spent 8 months in Japan, they were really able to talk about what happened at Heart Mountain, which I never heard anything because remember, Setsuko and my father didn't talk about it much. So Sumiko said to me, Chie, your grandmother, visited me in Saga, and she told me a lot about her life and what it was like to be in the United States, the discrimination and the hardship. And all the harvests were taken away from the farm. All the tools were taken away. And in California, they had to work so hard and everything was taken. And when the war was over, they had to start all over again because they had no money, they had no farm, they had no tools. They had to start completely over. And then Sumiko held me very close and she told me that she could feel my grandmother's presence in me. And the war, she said, had cost so many things to so many people. She and Chie had spoken all night about it and cried together. And now I was crying with her. You see, I always thought my grandmother, Chie, was a rock who did not let the incarceration experience bother her. In just a few moments with Sumiko, that myth had been shattered. But what I learned from this is I should not have to travel to Saga to learn something that someone in the United States could have told me. No one in my family had ever cried and held me like Sumiko. I wish that my own mother or my relatives in the United States could have held me in their arms and showed their emotions the way that Sumiko did. As a mother and a grandmother in my own right, sitting in the reception area of an assisted living center in Japan, I learned something that I should have known decades earlier. The Japanese-American incarceration and the war itself had fractured our families and also our ability to connect with our heritage in Japan. The Nisei, the quiet Americans, locked away their memories of the incarceration. While we strove to be the best Americans, we were taught to be ashamed of being Japanese. It has taken me a lifetime to realize that I am not alone. There are other Sansei daughters like me. Thank you very much, JIU University, for having me here today. Thank you.